high school was sometimes brutal. High school was sometimes quite brutal, especially PE class. When the teacher picked two team captains, I don't know if you guys had that experience, the teacher would get two team captains and then had those two captains pick their teams. The predictable hierarchy of choices followed. The sporty, the strong, the popular types were always picked first. Everybody else were left to last. No matter how we felt about this process as students, teams were picked, and we had to get on with the job at hand. Jesus, too, had to pick his team, his leadership team. This time, for him to pick these leaders came because more and more pressure and more danger was surrounding Jesus from a group called the Pharisees. This is what we found out in verse 11 last week. The Pharisees were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Or as another gospel account makes more explicit, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against Jesus, how to destroy him. With this background, the crucial moment had come for Jesus to call, to train, to develop some of his disciples into future leaders, ordinary men who would become sturdy men. Ordinary men who would become sturdy men. So let's look at how Jesus chose 12 disciples, why Jesus chose 12 disciples, and finally, what we can learn about these 12 disciples. So our first question, how did Jesus go about the crucial choice of 12 disciples? How did he go about choosing 12 ordinary men to become sturdy men? Verse 12 tells us, in the days that the Pharisees were scheming to kill Jesus, he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer before God. Jesus prayed. That is how he went about choosing 12 disciples. Jesus prayed. And I can think of two factors that would have driven Jesus to this extraordinary effort in prayer. One is that Jesus knew that this bitter wave of hostility was building up against him. These Pharisees weren't just going to go away. Time wasn't going to heal the wound. These Pharisees were intent on destroying him. So much so that the Pharisees concluded, of course, that Jesus is nothing but trouble and better off dead. And so Jesus needed to pray about that. He needed to seek his heavenly Father. He needed time to pray and sift through their hostility toward him and his righteous response to them. Here we can learn a lot from Jesus. We can learn a lot from Jesus here. Some of us are wired to make prayer the very last thing we do in a difficult situation. It's true. I've recognized it in my own life, and maybe you recognize it in yours. Sometimes we make prayer the very last thing we do when we're in a difficult situation. By nature, we will act, maneuver, scheme, plot, and generally do anything to work our way out of a hard situation except pray. It must be said, sometimes prayer becomes a bit of an afterthought to us. But Jesus, by his own example, shows the reverse to be the wiser path. Aware of the hard situation, the danger to his life is really in danger, he went out to the mountain to pray. That is his instinctive response. Things are really hard, instinctively he goes to pray. And the text tells us something's found nowhere else in the Bible. This is the only time this is recorded in the Christian scriptures, that Jesus went out to pray all night long. That's an extraordinary effort in prayer, wouldn't you say? I don't know what your prayer life is like. I don't know how long you pray or how often you pray. In 2019, quite a significant study was done by Crossway, which showed that most Christians do pray daily, and that was very encouraging. And that most Christians prayed for somewhere between 5 to 45 minutes. But it was significantly harder to find Christians who spent more than 45 minutes in prayer at any one time. And look, this is not a question of what's right and wrong. There is no golden standard for the ideal length of any prayer. But what I am trying to point out is this: anything that causes us to be consumed by prayer for extended periods of time, anything that just consumes us to pray lots and lots and lots, must have been important. It must have been weighty. It must have been crucial, which I think was the case for Jesus. Jesus was consumed by prayer all night long because he had a very important, weighty, and crucial decision ahead of him. Who would he choose as 12 disciples to train as future leaders of the church? It's weighing on his mind. The time is coming. I have to pick. So who am I going to pick? And it's very important that he picks the right men. The weight of his decision required lots and lots of prayer. And if we're learning from Jesus, if we read the Christian scriptures with an intent to learn something, to learn from Jesus, there is a way to put this into practice ourselves. We might not have the stamina or the capacity for all-night prayer, but we can do this. Before we make major decisions, any big decisions, it is good and wise to seek God in especially earnest prayer before we make that decision. And this could be any big decision that comes into your life, right? And as you start to do adult stuff, if you start to adult life, and you're growing up and finally move out of mum and dad's place and whatever it is, you're going to start making big decisions. You're going to be talking about the change of a job. You're going to be thinking about study. You're going to be thinking about moving cities. You're going to be thinking about marriage. You're going to be thinking about what church to serve and belong to. All these are really big decisions that you have to bathe in prayer. This is what we can learn from Jesus. The big decision comes, and prayer is a good starting point for making that big decision. Just for illustration, before Anna and I moved to Hamilton, we were contemplating moving overseas for a sabbatical and some study. We knew it would be a very big decision, and so we prayed a lot. We were asking the Lord to direct our steps. We were, Lord, these are the things before us. We desire both. What do we do? How will you direct us? What door will you open? What door will you close very hard so that it's obvious to us where to go? And as it went, we began to take practical steps toward one goal. We started getting new passports, and we went to the embassy and got our international student visas, and we found a house to move into overseas, and still we continued in prayer. And within the space of a week, within the space of a singular week, almost every door to move overseas began to inexplicably close, and every other door to move to Hamilton and plant this church opened. I'm thankful for the way that the Lord answers prayer. I'm thankful for the way that the Lord is at work when we bring to Him our big decisions that are before us, earnestly seeking Him for direction. And that's what Jesus did far better than I ever could. He had a major decision on His hands. Who to choose as future leaders of the church, and He soaked that decision in an extended time of prayer, leaving for us an example of earnest and ongoing prayer to imitate. Then, after the night of prayer, morning came. He prays all night long, and sure as anything, the sun is coming up, and he has to make his decision of 12 disciples. He had prayed, and now decision-making time is upon him. As verse 13 says, "And when day came, Jesus called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles." Let me briefly just clarify what these words, disciples and apostle, mean. Jesus called disciples, and this is generally what we would think of as a student or an apprentice. But this was more than inviting a student into a classroom or a lecture. To be a disciple in Jesus' day was to become personally affiliated with your teacher or your rabbi. When a rabbi said, "Be my disciple," you would join yourself to him. You would become attached to him in a significant way. As one scholar, Leon Morris, pointed out, he said a disciple was a learner, a student, but in the first century, a student did not simply study a subject. He followed a teacher. There was an element of personal attachment. So Jesus was calling 12 men into an immersive apprenticeship experience. This is life immersion with Jesus, giving them constant opportunity to observe him, to learn from him, to ask questions, to grow as future leaders of the Christian church. But the text also says that Jesus named them apostles. He calls them to be disciples, to learn from him constantly, but then he said he names them apostles. And this is slightly more than a disciple. This is slightly more than a disciple. Where a disciple was an apprenticing student, an apostle was an elevated position of authority. The word apostle carries, of course, the idea of an ambassador or an official delegate. Perhaps imagine a king. Set your mind back, perhaps in history. You imagine a king, and this king chooses an official delegate. And he gives this delegate his signet ring. And he gives this delegate his authority. And he gives this delegate his message to present to a far-off country. You are to go and do this in my name, with my authority, with my signet ring in your possession. That is what these disciples would become. They would become these apostles, these official delegates of King Jesus. They would have his approval and his endorsement to proclaim his true message to the world. But to entrust 12 disciples with an act of such high and official capacity, right? For Jesus to choose 12 men to represent him to the world once he's gone is an important decision, right? This is not PE class choosing the popular guys. This is far more important than choosing just the sporty types or the popular types. It is a highly important decision because of the task that they'd be required to do in Jesus' absence. Jesus needed to pick the right disciples to become future leaders of the Christian church. Knowing this, we want to focus our attention on another question. Why did Jesus choose 12 disciples? He's going to choose 12, but have you ever stopped and thought about that? Like, why did he choose 12? Why not 5? Why not 14? Why is he always choosing these 12 disciples? Why is 12 so important to Jesus? Interestingly, the answer to that comes from the Old Testament. Jesus chooses 12 because he's pulling a principle out of the Old Testament. There, the people of God saw themselves as descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 foundational leaders of their people. That is their history. This is who we are. We are descendants of the 12. Jesus, however, was busy reconstructing a new people for God. He was reproducing Israel. And to make sure we understand this is exactly what he was doing, he used the same model God used in the Old Testament. 12 leaders at the foundation of the new people of God. As one commentator said, the 12 sons of Jacob, from whom the whole Israelite nation had grown, were to be replaced by the 12 apostles, who would stand at the head of the whole new people of God. This is why the specific choice of 12 disciples was so important to Jesus. It's not 5, it's not 14, it's 12, and it's deliberately 12 because he's signaling something. He is embedding something in history, saying, here is the people of God. Here is 12 foundation stones who would lay the groundwork for all future church. Even so, we're also asking, why did Jesus choose these 12 men as future apostles? I mean, what? You go through that list and you have to be asking yourself, why? What is so special about these guys? I mean, they're pretty ordinary people. They are just ordinary people. Certainly, they're not the movers and the shakers of their society. These men certainly are not the people climbing the social ladders and making all the right friends in all the right places. And certainly not the blazing model of modern leadership theory, which is that the key to a successful team is to employ for yourself visionary thinkers, strategists, empathetic communicators, innovators, operational executives, networkers, problem solvers, and cultural catalysts. That is what you need if you're going to put a team together for any measure of success. Rather, the 12 men that Jesus picked to be future leaders were ordinary folk, mostly blue-collar workers, some fishermen, a former government employee, a guy who certainly hated government employees, a couple of others we know relatively little about, and even a scoundrel, Judas Iscariot, who wouldn't make the final cut. These are the people Jesus picks. More than this, there are all kinds of messy group dynamics between these guys. There are all kinds of messy group dynamics that need to be budgeted for. You had fishermen, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and you had a former tax collector who worked for the government, Matthew. And you had Simon, who was called the Zealot, the guy who didn't like the government at all and was itching for a coup against the Roman authorities. These are all messy dynamics. That's a difficult group of people to get together for a drink. Matthew would have been taxing the fishermen. Simon would have hated Matthew because he worked for the government. And Peter and his boys were probably pretty sour about always being ripped off by Matthew, the tax collector. All this to say, as we go through the list of whom Jesus called to be disciples and apostles, many of these disciples probably weren't going to get along as natural friends who just loved spending time together. That's probably not the baseline that Jesus was working with. Who are the 12 closest friends? Let's pick them. That's not what Jesus did. So why did Jesus choose them? Why does he choose people like that to work with? Well, there's probably more than one answer to this, but let me suggest just two answers for you. Let me suggest two reasons why Jesus would pick people like this. Firstly, Jesus chose them not so much for what they were, but what they would become. It's not so much what they were, but what they would become. In them, Jesus recognized the potential and then trained them accordingly. Jesus sees these guys and he goes, yep, these are guys with potential and I'm going to train them accordingly. And this is a very important detail. Years ago, I heard about John Stott. John Stott was a very famous English clergyman, a churchman, a pastor in the UK. And John Stott was very well respected. He was an immensely respected church leader in his day, and he had a very keen eye for picking potential leaders. He was very, very good at spotting people with the potential to lead. Very good at it. Once he recognized a man with potential, he encouraged him to think about training for the Christian ministry. He would simply say to them, "Hey, have you thought about training for the Christian ministry? Have you thought about training to become a pastor?" About 10 years ago, I had the privilege of meeting one of John Stott's men. He was a mathematician. He was a mathematician at the time that John Stott called him to think about Christian ministry. And so he went from his job as a mathematician and retrained in theology and served a church here in New Zealand, in Hillsborough, Auckland, an Anglican church named St. Margaret's. He did this for decades. He now lives here in Hamilton, retired. It seems it wasn't so much what they would become that caught Jesus' attention, but what they were that caught Jesus' attention, but what they would become. It was their potential for church leadership, which Jesus recognized among his disciples. It is an important thing to think about. Secondly, Jesus chose this mixed bag of disciples, I think, because it would make it all the more obvious that the establishment of Christianity in the world would not and could not be explained in mere terms of a skill set and persuasive personalities. Jesus chose these men because when we look back in history, as we come up with new theories on leadership and all that sort of thing, we wouldn't just go back to these disciples who changed the face of the world and go, "Oh yeah, the reason they were so good at what they did is because they possessed these skill sets. They had very persuasive personalities." And that is to be credited for the rise of Christianity throughout the world. Jesus chose these men precisely to prove the opposite. It had nothing to do with their skill sets or their persuasive personalities that the future of Christianity would rest upon. The explanation for Christianity's founding, its sticking power, and enduring appeal would have to be found elsewhere. One Puritan helpfully said that 12 poor men taken out of boats and creeks without any help of learning should conquer the world to the cross might have been thought of an illusion against all reason of men. Yet we know it was undertaken and accomplished by them. It just goes against reason to think that these 12 guys were going to change the face of the world. And there it is. We know that it happened. J.C. Ryle also noted, "A religion which did not flatter the rich, the great, and the learned. A religion which offered no license to the carnal inclinations of man's heart. A religion whose first teachers were poor fishermen without wealth, rank, or power. A religion could never have turned the world upside down if it had not been of God." If it had not been of God. That is why I think Jesus' choice of these 12 men was all the more staggering, because it amplifies the point that Christianity would and could only succeed if God was in it. The only way you can explain why Christianity succeeded is to point at God and say, God must have been in this. God must have been the one behind this. God was the one who was empowering this whole thing to take off and advance to the ends of the world. That is indeed what it amplifies, that God was in it, with their central message that the gospel of Jesus Christ crucified and raised for sinners is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. It really was a testament that it is the power of God at work. Thinking about Jesus choosing such mere mortals as these disciples to change the world, it might be helpful to go back to the earlier illustration then, just briefly, just to the earlier illustration. Jesus choosing these men was like a team captain choosing the underdogs. He chooses the guys that are obviously probably not going to get picked first. He chooses the underdogs, the less athletic types, the less sporty types, the less popular types, and trains them up to win the competition. That is what's going on here. It is obvious to the world then that God was in it, and that Jesus' prayer was indeed answered according to the wisdom of God. And this is a last point I'd like to share with you from the text. These underdogs entered the school of discipleship with Jesus. There they learned about life in the kingdom of God. They learned how to forgive and to be forgiven. They learned the scriptures together. They learned how to grow as believers in Jesus, who died for their sins and who was raised from the dead and then conquered the world with the gospel. That is what they would learn in the school of discipleship. And in this school of discipleship, ordinary men became sturdy men. Just ordinary men became sturdy men. All of them except Judas Iscariot, who died in suicidal regret for making a quick buck by betraying Jesus. All the others would go on to be sturdy men who laid the foundation of Christianity. And I say sturdy men because almost all of these future apostles, apart from John, died violent deaths for their faith in Jesus. They became sturdy men to the bitter end because they died for their faith. Horribly violent deaths, believing what Jesus taught them was so true and real that it was worth dying for. Peter, Andrew, Philip, and Jude were all crucified for their faith in Jesus. Simon the Zealot was either crucified or sawn in half for his faith in Jesus. James, the son of Zebedee, was beheaded for his faith in Jesus. Bartholomew was tortured by having his skin peeled off his body and then beheaded for his faith in Jesus. Thomas was likely speared to death for his faith in Jesus. Matthew, that former tax collector, was slaughtered with a pickaxe for his faith in Jesus. Of James, the son of Alphaeus, it was recorded at the age of 94, old man, he was thrown down from a great height, beat and stoned by the Jews, and finally had his brains dashed out with a club. John was probably the only disciple that didn't have a violent death, but not for lack of people trying. It wasn't for lack of people trying. It has been traditionally understood that his persecutors tried to boil him alive. They tried to boil him to death. Somehow he survived, and so they exiled him to a tiny island called Patmos. And just out of interest, Matthias, who took Judas's place as an apostle, was beheaded for his faith in Jesus. And Paul, the last appointed apostle, it has been traditionally understood that he too was beheaded for his faith in Jesus. All this to make the point that in the school of discipleship with Jesus, ordinary men ended up becoming sturdy men. Men who would endure, men who stood in the trialing hour for their faith in Jesus Christ. Sturdy men who turned the world upside down with the message that Jesus is Lord and that all the prophets bear witness that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. Ordinary men became sturdy men and turned the world upside down. Let's pray.